When we think of the beauty of the human body in ancient art and sculpture, we often picture the female form, like the Venus de Milo in the Louvre, or the Winged Victory, or even a Botticelli painting. But what about the male body? That's been carved into stone for almost 5,000 years in some of the greatest pieces of classical art, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the tombs of Egypt to the marbles of Greece. And it is spectacular to behold. I'm going to take you on a tour of the male body in art at the British Museum in London, one of the greatest museums in the world. As we trace the male body through time, how it was imagined, idealized, and even desired, we'll see how each culture defined strength, divinity, and even masculinity itself very differently. And along the way, you'll get a deep dive into some of the greatest works of art you'll ever set eyes upon. And this might be the pinnacle, a reclining figure from the Parthenon marbles. He doesn't move. He doesn't need to speak. Every line of his body tells you what ancient Greece thought beauty was. And nearby, carved into the same stone, men wrestling with centaurs, legs splayed, muscles straining, caught between civilization and chaos. The Parthenon marbles here at the British Museum are not only among the most famous pieces of art in existence, they're an incredible testament to the ideal male form that has influenced Western tradition to this very day. But how did we get here? What was the journey like from stick figures to these sculpted gods? We're going to come back and study these classical Greek male sculptures right here, inch by inch. But before we do that, to really understand the history of how the male form was depicted in art, we have to go way back. And we can do that right here at the British Museum. We're not just going to go back to Greece or Rome, but to the beginnings of civilization, and even before, to the beginnings of the body in art. 17,000 years ago, in a dark cave beneath the hills of what we now call France, someone lit a torch. They weren't priests or kings. There were no cities yet, no writing, no pyramids. And yet, there was art. Among the galloping bulls and leaping deer, one image stands apart. It's called the Shaft of the Dead Man. It's a tiny, awkward, and possibly dead male figure. It might be the oldest depiction of the male body in the world, and it tells us everything about what it meant to be human long before civilization. So I actually went here to Lascaux caves, and by the way, this is the only piece of art that I'm going to talk about in this video that is not actually at the British Museum. So I'm going to be a little bit quicker about this piece because I want the video to be about everything that you can see as far as the male body and its evolution at the British Museum. But I really wanted to start here because these cave paintings are the first art that we know of. It keeps changing because we find more discoveries, and as of the making of this video, actually the first cave art that we believe found is in Indonesia. It's a warty pig. But one of the most famous and one of the most beautiful and important was found in France, in the Dordogne region, and it's from the Upper Paleolithic. It's called Lascaux, the Lascaux Caves. So I had the privilege of actually going there. Nobody, unless you're an expert, is going to actually be able to see this image for real anymore because there was so much damage from the tourists going into the caves that they closed it off and they built an exact replica on site. So I did go and I did see it on site exactly as it is. So I looked up and got to see this image. Now, most of the artwork in this cave was of animals. It's very, very rare to see a man, but here we do. So what exactly do we see in this cave painting? Well, we see a wounded bison, very large, and it actually has its intestines kind of spilling out from its side. So this was probably some sort of a hunt or a ritual. we really know quite little about it. We do see a bird in the image, and the man seems to almost have the head of a bird, either that or they were trying to emphasize his mouth being opened. It's almost a stick figure. If you'll notice, you actually do see the stick figure image of what looks like specific male anatomy there. So even from the very beginning, we are depicting women like the Venus of Willendorf as very fertile. Perhaps that was why the man was depicted this way. Maybe it's meant to be male power or virility or fertility. Maybe it's meant to be strength. We know very, very little, and we can only really speculate based on the other pieces of evidence that we find. There's a broken spear that looks like it pierced the bison, so we do see that, and we see a bird that looks like it's on a pole. So is it a totem? Is it a symbol? We don't know, but it's a fascinating example of the beginning of the depiction of humans, and specifically males, in art. What was important when we first depicted the male? You can see it right there. So just a quick little bit of context. This is called the Upper Paleolithic. It's a very long time ago. It's about 15,000 to 17,000 BC. So we're talking 12,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, 14,000 years before those Parthenon marbles that I showed in the beginning of this video, and 19,000 years before your iPhone or Android. Homo sapiens had already existed, that's us by the way, for over 200,000 years. But when this was painted, it was the height of Ice Age art in Europe. Humans would have lived in small bands of hunter-gatherers, 20 to 50 people at a time, constantly moving to follow game and seasonal food sources, which makes sense why this image and most of the images would focus on these animals. And it also makes sense why art wasn't that well developed yet, because usually, and what we'll see when we start looking at the civilizations, is that you have to have a stratified social structure. You have to have someone or many people who dedicate all of their time to art, and that someone else is feeding them. And that usually takes a surplus, which comes from administration and a stratified society, which we do not have yet. So here, in the Paleolithic imagination, the human body was not yet the center of the universe, not yet a thing to be worshipped or perfected, like we see in the later Greek Parthenon marbles. This is where the story begins, at places like Lascaux. Not with beauty, but with awe and with symbols. Before the male body could be idealized, it had to be imagined. Next, I'm going to take you into the British Museum. Now, the British Museum is one of the best museums in the entire world. It does compete with the Louvre, except that the British Museum kind of stops in ancient times, whereas the Louvre keeps going on to paintings. I always say that if you combined the British Museum with the National Gallery in London, you'd actually have a museum that was even better than the Louvre. So that puts it into context. If you are able to come to the British Museum in London, you should. And if you're not, watch videos like this, because it's one of the most interesting and educational places you could ever go, because it brings history to life. So everything that I talk about in this video, from here on out, in exploring the history of the male body all the way from the beginning, are actual things that you can see right now and forever, probably, in the British Museum. So we're going to go back into the oldest sections of the British Museum, and by that I mean the oldest things that they have, and those are prehistoric. If the figure at Lascaux was alone in mystery, this one is not. What you see here are two bodies entwined in a quiet, eternal embrace. There's no war here, no gods and no heroes, just a moment of human closeness carved by hand, and this was carved over 11,000 years ago. It's the earliest known image of two people in an intimate situation. We believe that it is probably a man and a woman. That is what most scholars believe, but it is uncertain. Some do speculate that it is actually two males. But this is the first depiction of two human bodies intertwined in sculpture that we found anywhere in the world. So they're called the Ain Sakri lovers. They were discovered in 1933 in a cave near Bethlehem, in what is now the West Bank in the Judean desert. They date to around 9,000 BC, so we're getting closer and closer with each piece. placing it at the very dawn of settled human life. So basically, this is in between the prehistoric times of the hunter-gatherers and the times of the developed city-states. It's the beginnings of settlements, maybe the beginnings of towns. So at this time, people are beginning to farm cereals, domesticate animals, build semi-permanent stone houses, and form these early communities. But for some reason, it was also important for them to make this symbol of these two lovers. If you look at it, it basically fits in the palm of your hand. It shows their legs overlapping, their arms and legs both intertwined. It is definitely a symbol of union, meaning that one of the first times that we ever see the male body in the beginning of towns and cities, we see it in union with another person. That was the emphasis here, that the male body was something that was meant as more than something to hunt with, but something to be social with and to be intimate with. It's made of a single piece of calcite cobble, so it's meant to last. Scholars do believe that the artist actually intentionally left out the detail, so you don't see any clear faces or any even beginnings of shapes of faces, and you don't see any biological certainty. It's believed that that may have been intentional, which is actually very fascinating, kind of makes openness part of its power. I really recommend, if you do go to the British Museum, this is one of the smallest things that you can see here. There are so many big, beautiful statues, but I recommend you go and see it because it is really, really significant in the history of art and really in world history. And one last thing to notice about this sculpture is that if one or if both of the figures are male, neither is dominant. So imagine if it's a man and a woman, the male is not dominant here. He's engaged in an act of shared vulnerability. So this is capturing connection. It's not capturing dominance or power or even virility. It's showing humans as social and intimate and loving, perhaps joy and pleasure seeking, but not looking to destroy or dominate, which is going to be the emphasis of so much art once civilizations begin, as you will see. Fascinating thing to see inside the British Museum. But as humans settle, grow crops, and build walls, like those famous Wall of Jericho, this raw intimacy and emphasis on procreation or love, sensuality, it starts to give way to structure. The earliest cities emerge in Mesopotamia. That means between the rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. The cities emerge, and with them, kings, soldiers, and systems of power. Now, the good thing is, now that we have a bunch of people controlling a bunch of other people, the peasants can make a lot of food for the people that are sitting around making art, so the art can get even better and better and better. The downfall is that now there's this stratification of society, and there are haves and there are have-nots. Basically the beginning of civilization, and that has not really ended. We're unfortunately kind of going back and forth in our own time between how big is the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But some of that gap is necessary in order for art to evolve, ironically. We're going to go into Iraq, and we're going to go to the section of the British Museum that has some of the most famous pieces in the art world history. With the standard of Ur, suddenly the male body becomes not something to embrace, but something to rank, to display, and to control. In this new world, beauty has rules and a system, and the male form must fit inside of that system. Nowhere is this clearer than in a small, jewel-like box buried in a royal tomb. And again, it's called the Standard of Ur. If you're like me and you took the history of Western civilization, it was probably one of those big pictures in your textbook. It's one of the most famous objects in the entire museum and one of the oldest and one of the most important. So let's dig into it. First of all, you're not going to see any gorgeous, fantastic, rippled, billowing men's bodies on this standard of Ur. And that's actually why it's important. I wanted to show this to you so that you can see the evolution of art and the evolution of the male body. Even from just your first glance, you can tell that the male bodies themselves are not that impressive in this standard. But we'll get to that and I'll describe them. Let me tell you a little bit about the context of this amazing piece of world history. So we are now in Sumer. Now we are around 2600 to 2400 BC, so we're only 4,000 years ago. We're starting to get into the times of ancient civilizations. Usually, we talk about civilizations, we mean that it had writing and social stratification. It's kind of a basic marker of civilization. The kind of writing they used here, by the way, was called cuneiform, and it was used to record everything from business to mythology. And it's also one of the most fascinating artifacts you can see here, the cylinder scrolls and the different types of cuneiform at the British Museum. If you're interested in Mesopotamian art, it's a fantastic place for it. Probably the best in the world. So here's society stratified. You have kings, priests, soldiers, and slaves. This standard of Ur was found in what we believe is a royal grave. We don't really know what it is. It's called the standard of Ur because they believe that it was like attached to a pole and held as a standard in battle. But later scholars kind of question that and really don't know what it actually was. But we do know that it was found alongside gold helmets, lyres, and elaborate burials. It's about the size of kind of a big briefcase. I stood next to it for a really long time, so I'll never really forget the context and the size. I definitely recommend you do not miss it if you go to London. But it's all about what's carved on its sides, because it shows a complete worldview. You'll have to forgive me if I sound almost geekily excited. As I'm making this video for you, I've just gotten back from the British Museum and I'm looking at these images and videos that I took while I was there and getting excited just telling you about them. And I love zooming in. So just so you know the materials here. So this standard of Ur, it's a wooden box, but it's inlaid with shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli. These were all precious materials that would have had to have been sourced from far away. So this is already a huge difference between the kind of art that we would have seen in prehistoric times, because remember, those were bands of 20 to 50 people, hunter-gatherers. There wouldn't have been anywhere near the level of trade enough to bring lapis lazuli all the way from wherever it came from. I think it was Afghanistan or somewhere quite far. So we already are seeing, just in the existence of this artwork, a whole new world. What you're seeing here, you basically see two major sides. One we traditionally call war, and the other we call peace. On both sides, whether it is people lining up in a procession to pay tribute to the king, or whether it is a scene of battle where you actually see soldiers trampling their enemies for the first time in art history that I'm aware of. Either way, you see the male body in a very basic form. The only thing they're really doing to change the male body when you're looking at the different ones in this standard of Ur is that they're making the king, who's at the top, because the narrative goes from bottom to top. It's kind of a story going from bottom to top. The king is the biggest. Now, they're not necessarily making him with big muscles. They're not really doing anything besides literally just making him so big that his head kind of pops out of the frame of this piece of art. And the rest that you see, we believe it's mostly men or all men here on the standard of Ur. They are wearing what looks kind of like a kilt, and they're not wearing anything on top. They're bare-chested. So I'm looking at them right now with you, and the only details we're seeing a little mark to mark the curvature of the elbow. There's almost no upper body muscle. Their faces all look the same, their noses look the same, their haircuts look the same, especially depending on their class. And this is what's really going on. So the male body now is being used. It's not showing anatomical detail. It's not meant to be something to be worshipped in and of itself as a piece of beauty. It's just meant to show your rank. You're smaller and you're dressed differently if you're of a lower rank. There's just a couple small things to notice about the male body besides the relative size that point to some of the values of the society or of the artists, and that is clothing versus naked. So what you're seeing here is, especially on the side that's labeled war, the people that are conquered are naked, and the people that conquered them are clothed depending on their rank. Obviously, the king looks like he's probably clothed the most, and people have different outfits depending on what they're doing. But the prisoners or the defeated look as if they're almost completely naked, and you actually can see their male anatomy. And this is something that's going to be interesting as we look at the way that the male body is treated in art. What's interesting is that here, their male anatomy actually does look proportionate and normal, how a normal man would probably look naked today in terms of the size of everything. That is not going to be the case for very long moving forward. And definitely by the time we get to the Greek marbles, which are so beautiful and really idealize the male nude as kind of the height of beauty, one of the interesting things that happens is they actually start to minimize the male anatomy, the phallus area, because they believe that it would be vulgar to have large male anatomy down there. And it would be a representation of kind of disorderliness or vulgarity. But this idea wasn't around yet here in the Standard of Ur, so that's something to kind of point out, because that is something that will change. The nudes look anatomically correct and normal for the most part. They look like somebody that you might see today. Maybe not the haircut, of course. Another thing that we notice, there's one key difference. Some think that this might be a woman, but most think that it's actually is a man. And it's on the side that's peace, and it's up at the top, and it's the one with the really long black hair. So the one thing they're doing there, they believe that's probably a singer because he's standing behind the person playing the lyre instrument. It's a really, really cool side tangent. That lyre instrument that guy's playing there, you can actually see that as well in the British Museum. So this is all just really mind-blowing. But anyway, the singer, who they think is probably the singer with the arms over the chest, almost like about to do a serenade or a song or some sort of votive performance, they are distinguishing that singer by having a different hairstyle. So that is something that we're going to see with in terms of the male body, is that hair on the male body in any part of the male body is something that people kind of use and change to depict and mean different things. And here they're doing it on the head. The longer hair on the head is a special role. It's something fancy. So to sum it up, here the male body is just visual code. Who has power, who obeys, who suffers, and maybe who sings. There is no emphasis on strength, there's no emphasis on beauty or individuality. Instead, men are parts of a system. But since the British Museum has collections of some of the greatest civilizations in world history, we are now going to travel along the banks of another great river, the Nile, where something different was unfolding, and where the male body was depicted a little bit differently. While Sumer was busy inventing kingship, Egypt was inventing eternity. So if you're not already really excited about the British Museum, you probably should be by now, because we're about to move into the Egyptian section. This is one of the best museums in the world for Egyptology. That you're only going to find anything better probably in the new museum that they're opening in Cairo, maybe aspects of the Louvre. But this is absolutely one of the best Egyptian collections. Most people come to the British Museum and they go straight to what's called the Rosetta Stone, because that was one of the first ways we were able to understand Egyptian hieroglyphics. But the topic of this video is the male form. So we're going to look at some of their Egyptian masterpieces. Now, the British Museum divides their Egyptian section kind of into two sections. One is upstairs, and it's near where the mummies are, and that's where we're going to start today. I'm going to go through the Egyptian section a little bit faster because there's so much ground to cover, but there's really cool things that I found that show how we started to evolve in our idea of depicting the male body. The first thing that I want to show you is not one of these grand ruler gods or pharaohs. The first thing I'm going to show you is a peasant with a hoe next to a peasant that is brewing beer. Now, if you look at these right now, you already see a huge difference from what you saw in the last piece that we examined, which was the Standard of Ur. There, the bodies there was nothing kind of geometric about them. The human form had not really, it didn't stand out in any way. But here, already with the peasant and the hoe and the peasant brewing beer, if we look carefully, we're starting to see certain ideals of the male body, even in peasant form. Well, first of all, we're starting to see things as more realistic. We're seeing people, men in motion, men doing things, men taking action. We're also starting to see something that is very common when we're going to look at any type of imagery in Egypt of men, and it's that their skin is darker and often tanned. And we know that because sometimes they will be seated next to women, which we'll see shortly, and the women will have lighter skin and the men will have darker skin. And we think that part of that was because men would have been more likely to be working outside, and that became part of the aesthetics, because even the pharaohs ended up having, the males would have darker skin. So we see that in this object. What else we're looking at right here? If we look at the peasant with the hoe, and specifically if we look at the peasant brewing beer, we see broad shoulders and a small waist. And so what we're starting to see here, it's very interesting because we don't see this tiny waist in the later Greek and Roman statues. This is somewhat unique to Egypt. And what we're seeing here is their idea of masculinity. And what that is almost a geometric balance. So the broad shoulders are meant to kind of symbolize sturdiness being balanced over that small, geometrically shaped waist. So it's really an interesting take on how the male body is or should be. We're definitely seeing here function over form. Now we're going to move to another room where you can see sarcophagi, and this is where the mummies would have been inside. They actually have the mummies and the sarcophagus next to it, for example, and of many different Egyptian rulers and notable people. This one that I'm going to show you is from what is called the sarcophagus of Hor, H-O-R. And the image that I'm going to show you is very beautiful. If you look at it right now, you see two men facing each other. The one is obviously in the higher position that has the white band and the white covering. By the way, notice with this Egyptian art, you are almost always going to have the men covered below the waist. So that's something else notable about how they're depicting men here. The man here has long hair. The chest is mainly exposed, and we are seeing that classic Egyptian style of showing the man, those broad shoulders and the tight waist, almost making that kind of geometric triangle. We are starting to see the beginnings of shoulder and bicep muscles being shown. You can see it in kind of both characters, but more so in the man with the leopard outfit, I believe that is. But also notable, look at how thin the legs are. We're not seeing any calf muscle. So these men were not running around and jumping. That wasn't a sign of status. And this was probably not a warrior, or if he was standing in a chariot being driven by others. This is going to be in sharp contrast to what we're going to see next, because the British Museum has the best Assyrian collection of reliefs of anywhere in the world. There isn't even anything like that in Syria or Iraq anymore. It's in the British Museum, and it's wonderful. It's called the Assyrian Lion Hunt, and there you're going to see huge muscular calves. So I want you to think about that in contrast to what we're seeing here with these Egyptians. Moving along in this wonderful Egyptian section of the British Museum, we're going to come to a whole room, and it's called the Tomb Chapel of Nebamun. This is from the New Kingdom of Egypt, around 1350 BC, and it's mostly plaster wall paintings from Thebes. Nebamun, the man, he was a wealthy scribe and an accountant for the temple grain stores. So this tells us something right there. We have all these paintings, these images of him, and he wasn't royalty, he wasn't a pharaoh, and he wasn't a peasant like we saw with the peasant with the hoe that was actually meant to be part of the scene going along into the afterlife with a pharaoh so that they could have someone making beer for them and hoeing the land for them forever and forever. Here we're seeing this Nebamun. He's hunting birds with a throw stick, and he has his wife and daughter nearby, but he's much larger than them. He is what you might call bourgeoisie. which says a lot about what's going on in Egypt. It's such a big empire that it has different layers of society. So in this image of Nebamun, you can see lots of beautiful plants and animals that would have been around the Nile at the time. They're painted in this absolutely beautiful contrast of that blue and that almost ochre red or bronze color. But we're going to focus on the man in the middle. That's Nebamun, again, who he is hunting through the marshes along the Nile. He's depicted much larger than the women in his life. That's his wife and his daughter. His daughter's underneath him there. We're going to see some of these conventions that we already talked about. Those broad shoulders and that slim waist, covered from the waist to the knee almost, in the beautiful kind of white wrap. And we're seeing more than just that triangle of the shoulders and the waist. We're seeing another triangle, which kind of houses the daughter in the picture below him. And that's his legs making that triangle. And we're also seeing that darker skin tone here that characterizes the Egyptian males. What we're seeing in this pose, and what the male body is doing here in this example of Egyptian art, is that the pose is evoking mastery, control, and masculine grace through structure. Within the same tomb, there is a banquet scene, and this tells us something really interesting, like what I was talking about. You couldn't notice it as much in the marsh painting, but you definitely see it here, how the men are depicted differently than the woman. So let's look at the banquet scene. You have men sitting next to women. The woman kind of has her hand wrapped around the bicep area of the man. There's not much of a bicep there. But the man is much darker skinned than the woman. And it is not because they're members of a different race or anything like that. We believe it's because that was part of the aesthetic. Part of that comes from the idea that the men might have been working outside in the fields. But even if we're talking about upper class men, these men would have been more a part of the outside world, out in the sun, out in the world. And therefore we have kind of this symbolism and the aesthetic of their skin being several tones darker than the female, who maybe stayed behind, more protected in a more domestic or even household administrative role. The men are on the stools and the women are on a little bit of a comfy cushion that you see there, but you're definitely still seeing that symmetry. You're not seeing any development of muscles in the men here. You're just noticing that they still have some of that triangular form and the skin tone difference. So the men are shown here with these neat wigs and these elegant arms. The lack of muscle is actually intentional because Egyptian art is avoiding physical exaggeration. And that's because the ideal male is clean, composed, and contained. Next, we are going to go downstairs. The British Museum is so vast and so incredible and has such an amazing collection that they cannot even contain it all in one area. So the Egyptian collection, which is very important, is divided into the upstairs area where they have the mummies and some of the artworks that we already saw. But if you go downstairs near the very crowded Rosetta Stone, and remember the Rosetta Stone is also part of the Egyptian section because it was one of the first ways that we were able to delineate and figure out what Egyptian hieroglyphs meant. It's basically the translation stone. It's one of the highlights of the British Museum, but we're not going to focus on it on this video because we're talking about the male body. But very near there is the beautifully well-lit natural lighting section where you see all of the grand Egyptian statues. And one of the ones that I picked out for this video is called a statue of Nenkeftka. Nenkeftka. It's painted limestone statue with some substantial damage to the feet, but not completely, which is also another interesting point that I'm going to get to. This statue of Nenkeftka comes from the Middle Kingdom, from about 2040 to 1780 BC. So we're talking about 1,000 years after Ur, which was that standard of Ur that we saw in one of our first examples here. And it's several years before what comes next, which is the glorious Assyrian lion hunt. But I can't wait to talk about that. But let's focus on these statues for now. This Middle Kingdom was a period of political collapse and civil war. Egypt was beginning to reunite, and with it came a return to order, bureaucracy, and introspection. But what I find really interesting about this particular statue is, to me, it seems like we're starting to see a real man arise. We're still seeing the conventions of Egyptian depicting men in art. We're still seeing broad shoulders, and we're still seeing a little bit of a trimmer waist than would probably be on most normal men. A little bit of that triangle, but it's not as extreme. It's a little bit more realistic. We're starting to see a little bit more rounding of the biceps and a little bit more forearm. Not much, but just enough to make it a little bit more human. Where I really see a human being crawling out of the art of ancient times is when you look at the foot. You start to see the toenail, and the toes to me look like real humans' toes. This man was not, again, like the last one, he was not royalty and also not a peasant. Another example of this bourgeois class. He was a high-ranking official. But looking at his body, we start to see the formation of a new ideal of the male form, which is kind of a combination of the balance of the eternal male form and some realistic aspects of what a real man would look like. Very nearby is an incredible statue of King Thutmose III. This is from the New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty, ruled from around 1480 to 1425 BC. It's roughly contemporary with the height of the Assyrian expansion going on over in Mesopotamia, which we're going to talk about next. But we're still in Egypt, and I picked this piece because I think it's so fascinating. When you walk up to it, you don't see those Egyptian conventions staring you right in the face anymore. Yes, there still are broad, straight shoulders, but you're not quite seeing that same tiny waisted triangle. You're almost seeing, I don't want to use the word voluptuous, but being that this is a male, the breasts are quite rounded. Someone who's more critical or like a very gym person these days might even say that it looks a little bit flabby or sloppy, but that's not what was going on here. It wasn't the intention. What the Egyptian artists are trying to show here is that the pharaohs or the kings, which this is, were eternal, and they represented the entire cosmos. The entire cosmos has aspects of masculinity and femininity. It cannot be bound to one form. So that is perhaps why we're seeing some of that softness here. We want to see order. We want to see calmness. We want to see smoothness and ease. But we also want to see unity. It's also possible that they're trying to depict his body in a way that shows signs of health. Not somebody who's starving, not somebody who's under-eating. Maybe this is a nod a bit to fertility and to a land of plenty. In Egypt, we're not concerned with one moment in time. We're creating kings and divinity that are timeless and eternal and immortal. And in order to do that, they have to encompass more than one specific form and have to almost have some level of neutrality. Now, right next to it is one of my favorite pieces in the British Museum, especially for Egyptian art. It used to be a complete statue. What exists now in the British Museum is just the head and the arm. We're going to focus mainly on the arm because it is a really good example of how Egyptian art showed the male body and why it showed it that way. This is Amenhotep III from the New Kingdom. He ruled from about 1390 to 1350 BC. This comes about 100 years after the last guy, King Thutmose. Amenhotep was actually the father of Akhenaten, and for those of you who are into Egyptian studies and Egyptology, that's very significant, the reign of Akhenaten, but this was his dad. His body is immense. He was sculpted with broad, full chests. His face is kind of placid and idealized, but strong, sturdy, solid. But when you look at the arm, you see what I'm talking about. It is completely locked straight. To me, this says this is a line that you do not cross. It's not an arm that's bent. It's not taking any particular action. Because if it was, that action is temporary. This is permanent. It's a strong, solid fist. It is unstoppable. Now, you're not going to see really much of a forearm muscle. You're not going to see biceps. You're certainly not going to see any veins that you see a little bit later in Greek art, where their ideal is the individual and what they can achieve with the beauty of their body. No, here you're seeing timelessness and steadfastness. For those of you who know a little bit about Egyptian cosmology, there's the concept of Ma'at, which is order, and that's the opposite of Isfet, which is chaos. We're going to see this interplay between order and chaos in so many different cultures, but the way it expresses itself here in the Egyptian depiction of the male form is that the divine king, who is in the human world but not of the human world, must represent Ma'at, which is order, and that must come across in his posture, in his expression, and in his gestures. So here we have the straight line representing control and stability. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian kings ruled with stillness and symmetry, immortal in stone, gazing forward in eternal peace. But to the north and east of the deserts, in the rugged heart of Mesopotamia, a new image of masculine power was taking shape, one that roared with motion and muscle. Assyria was no land of simply serene gods. It was an empire of war, fear, and dominance. And the palace walls of Nineveh, here we find some of the most dynamic depictions of the male body in the ancient world. We don't have to go very far in the British Museum. We just have to turn the corner from the Egyptian section to get to the Assyrian lion hunt rooms. Several rooms. This is the greatest collection of Assyrian reliefs anywhere. There's nothing even like this in Syria or Iraq today. It's here at the British Museum. It is absolutely thrilling if you understand anything about ancient cultures or are interested at all in the history of artistic development in the earliest civilizations. Remember that in the beginning of this video, we started with the first civilization that we've ever known in Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Well, we're still between the Tigris and Euphrates River up north just a very little bit. The Assyrians have become the dominant power. And what you're going to see in their art is a bursting through, almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes of the human form and human emotion. This is called the Assyrian lion hunt. And the Assyrian lion hunt adorned the palace of a great king called Ashurbanipal. The two great kings of which we have some wonderful reliefs in different museums around the world are Ashurnasirpal II and Ashurbanipal. This lion hunt is from the palace of Ashurbanipal. And most of what's going on in these incredible reliefs, which you could spend all day in digesting and analyzing and just experiencing, is that the king would hunt lions. Okay, why? Well, this is really important for art history and world history. When we start to see the stratification of societies, we start to see massive agriculture. Now we have a huge group of people, and we need someone to administer that because there's a surplus to administer, and we're going to have special artisans that now can specialize and do certain things. And certain people can be full-time warriors because there's enough people and enough extra food to supply that. Certain people can be full-time artists because there's enough extra food to supply that. So we have these empires that have technologies and abilities artistically that we've never seen before. But what mainly does an empire need to do for its people? It needs to provide stability over the chaos. And the lion represents chaos. There were actually lions in the Middle East and in Europe in ancient times. They were a real threat to the people. People would have been afraid of lions the same way in medieval times they were afraid of wolves and like Little Red Riding Hood in the forest where some of those fairy tales come from. So this depiction of the king fighting lions basically means, I have subdued the world for you. It is now a peaceful place for you to go about your lives. Whatever your role is in our hierarchy, you may do so in peace. I have established order. I have vanquished the enemy. Now, the king didn't actually go out into the wild hunting these lions. You can even see in some of the images that they're coming out of a cage. So it's much like the gladiatorial games, actually. It became a tradition and more symbolic than an actual hunt in the wild. We're going to get into some of the fantastic depictions of the male body that I scoured these images for. But first, I just want to say one thing about the birth of human emotion in art. Now, we did see some of that in the Egyptian art. You started to see some unique facial expressions and maybe some unique features of the body, but not much. Now, in Assyrian relief art, we're starting to see emotion. Human emotion such as pain, sorrow, anguish. But it's really interesting because we're actually mostly seeing that pain and sorrow and anguish, which are human emotions, expressed through the death of these poor lions who are no longer in the wild being a threat to people, but are part of these gladiatorial games. Look at the expressions and the agony in these lions. This is an artistic height, bar none. There's so much to be said about the Assyrian lion hunts in the British Museum, but you came here for a discussion about the male body in art. And this is just mind-blowing, the leap that we're making here. I found it particularly when I started to look at the scenes in the relief of the warriors swimming from one side of the river to the other as part of a battle. Even their horses look like they're swimming with them. They're just taking this whole battle underwater. So with the Egyptians and with the standard of Ur, you saw that the men were naked from the top up, but they also had kind of a kilt on. All of a sudden, these men are naked in the water. These warriors with their rippling muscles are swimming across the river to vanquish the enemy. So let's take a look at some of these images where you can even see, is it dolphins or fish in the water? It's just incredible. And I've never actually seen anyone talk about this particular part of the Assyrian lion hunt panels. So if you zoom in, you're going to see something for the first time in this video, and probably among the first times in art. Look at the thigh muscles. They are delineated on purpose. Look at the calf muscles. This is the first time I've seen calf muscles like that. In the Egyptians, it was just the straight, kind of almost stick-like calves all the way down. Here you have a bulging calf muscle, an enormously powerful thigh. And if you look at the gluteus, the glutes, the butt here is just, the muscle is emphasized. This is a men, many of them, who are powerhouses because of their body. They are being propelled forward through the water by these legs, which are these glorious war machines, really, in this case. But in any case, they are symbols of strength and of power and of engagement and of activity. For sure, the emphasis is on the leg muscles here. It is also significant, I think, that the warriors are swimming almost naked. It does look like I see something around the waistband, but there might not be anything in front there. So we might be seeing a departure here from the Egyptians and the people from Ur, from Sumer, who were covered from the waist down. Here they don't care. We can see ribs, which means that these men are really fit because they have this upper body muscle, this lower body muscle, and then you can see their rib cage. They don't have an inch of fat. These are strong warriors. This is important to the artist to show that these men and how their bodies are. It's really a strong statement. Another interesting statement about the way males are depicted here is you see the unique Assyrian long hair. It's curly as well. And then you do see that curly beard. It has been said that when these were discovered and when all these Assyrian reliefs were discovered, it brought about this whole new trend of men having beards again because they thought it was so sexy. So here you go, these sexy Assyrian reliefs. Here in this art, we have unmatched realism for the time. We have psychological and emotional depth with the wounded lions, the calm king, the portrayal of total control. Here we have art as absolute imperial propaganda, but not just using different standardized forms, but by using the actual male body to send a message, using the calf muscles, the glute muscles, the beard, the nudity to convey a sense of raw power. Remember, some of the halls here were covered with dozens of feet of continuous panels, creating a cinematic corridor that narrated this king's greatness in sequence, and it inspired later traditions in Persia and in Greece and in Rome, which we're going to look at very soon. So though these reliefs are staged, they are visually thrilling. Lions leap and roar and fall to their deaths. Spears pierce flesh, chariots race through the dust, and the king even draws his bow mid-stride. In the swimmers, male anatomy is a force of nature. Gone are the days where it's just symbol and structure. These are real men, and these are high stakes. This is a turning point in art in Western civilization. But what is going on in other parts of the world? Well, my specialty is in Western art and Western civilization, which basically means starting in Mesopotamia, including Egypt and North Africa, and then, of course, spreading to Greece and Rome, the foundations of Europe and of our democratic systems in the Americas. But every great museum, the British Museum included, has sections from around the world. And the British Museum has incredible sections from other cultures. And I'm going to touch on some of those because I found it really fascinating how differently they depicted the male body. For a moment, let's travel within the British Museum over to India. I just want to take a quick second to ask everybody to hit like if you're enjoying this video. Your support really means everything, and it's what keeps this going from an intellectual, spiritual perspective, and also it just helps the algorithm know which kind of videos to suggest to which people. So please click like if you like it. Subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, because it's going to let YouTube know that this is the kind of stuff you like, and you're going to be one of the first to know when I have a new video. And feel free to say hi in the comments. I really love hearing from you. There are so many fascinating objects over here in the Asian section. It's just kind of on the other side through the beautiful, it's almost an open air courtyard, but it's covered by glass. It's just a fabulous museum. I recommend everyone sees it once in their life. If you go into this Asian section, you'll see things from India that are Buddhist or Hindu, and you also see a fascinating Chinese section. What I found that stood out to me right here with regards to how other cultures can depict the male form is called a standing Buddha. So this is a stone sculpture. It's actually from an area called Sultanganj in an area called Bihar. And apparently that was the center of Tantric Buddhist studies. And you can see in this image, that is Buddha, right? From the Western eyes, when you look at it, you might think that's maybe a female, but it is not. That is Buddha. That is a man. At his feet is someone named Maitreya. That's the Buddha of the future, kneeling at the feet of the current Buddha. And according to the British Museum, this whole thing refers to the concept outlined by the Buddha and developed by a philosopher named Nagarjuna, that all phenomena are temporary and therefore essentially empty. But what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how we see the male body and how we depict the male body? Well, let's take a look really specifically and talk about how the body is portrayed here. What's the first thing you see? First of all, absolutely no muscle delineation. The only thing that's delineated is the almost bikini-like kind of shorts, I suppose you could call them, that he is wearing. You can see toes that are delineated, which is interesting because we also saw that as one of the most realistic features in the Egyptian model. Again, the feet grounded to the earth. This particular Buddha is supposedly standing on a lotus petal. But the rest of the body, the only thing that stands out is the kneecaps. There's absolutely no muscle. The waist is not particularly slim. This is not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination. And it really does, to probably most Western eyes, look almost feminine. But let's talk about what could be the reasoning behind that. So what's going on here is that the male body is not being eroticized, desired, or militarized. None of those are in alignment with this middle path of Buddhism. This Buddha is a man that is refined, peaceful, and devotional. It's supposed to take you beyond the world of duality, not bring you closer down to earth. This is about transcendence. True enlightenment means rising above opposites. So rising above male and female, rising above pleasure and pain, rising above material and spiritual. A fully enlightened being, like the Buddha, exists beyond gender. We saw a little bit of that when we talked about King Thutmose III in Egypt. So there is kind of this common thread in religion. If you think about it, it's really also in the Abrahamic religions, because the ultimate God is a genderless, formless being. We're kind of hinting at that right here by saying this male body is not even distinctly male. It's beyond gender. And this is not weakness. It's actually strength, because it's a metaphor for cosmic unity. I also think it's important to point out that what you see here has a rhythm, has a kind of a suppleness, and it looks like it could flow. It is non-threatening and it can flow. And that's what a lot of, if you've studied world religions, I'm not a Buddhist, but I have studied it, and I also have friends that are Buddhist, and so much of a part of it is kind of this middle path, this way of flowing through the world and not getting caught up in the duality. And what a better way to flow than if your devotional object is a male whose body flows like this. Not far away at all is the second piece that I'd like to talk about. It's the Shiva Nataraja, the Lord of the Dance. You see it right away when you walk into this Asian section of the British Museum, but you immediately, from the Western eye, if you don't already know about Shiva from Hinduism, you think it's a woman. It is not. This is a male. This particular statue is from 1100 AD. It's from the Chola dynasty, which I believe is Tamil. What was going on here is that the Gupta and Pala empires, I believe the Buddha was from one of the Pala empires, they had faded and they were replaced by more regional kingdoms, especially coming up from the south. Now, Buddhism and Hinduism are both originally from India, but as we know, if we studied world religions, Buddhism kind of spread to other parts of Asia, and Hinduism became more dominant in India. So here we have Shiva. Shiva is the male lord of the dance. And when I look at this figure, if I kind of put on my Western American goggles, it almost looks like what we would think of as like a belly dancer, or even an erotic dancer trying to mesmerize us with a feminine pose. We have to completely get that out of our minds, because that's not what's going on here. This is a cosmic dance that Shiva is involved in. That circle, it's meant to be a circle that Shiva is standing in, because it's a cosmic cycle. Shiva is the destroyer. Imagine that, a destroyer with a body like that. So Shiva is a male, is a destroyer of the universe, and then it gets created again. It's revealing truth. It's granting protection. It's crushing ignorance. So the body is slim. It is not particularly muscular. It has a taut abdomen. It has flexed thighs, but it has that arched back. And that arched back is meant to show this absolute kind of balance and rhythmic control. The statue has almost what we would call an androgynous charisma. And what we're meant to think of and experience when we see this is the rhythm and the grace of the cosmic dance. So even though these deities, or in the example of the Buddha, are technically male, as most of the great world religions that became dominant in these hierarchical civilized societies were male-dominated, these males tended to oftentimes not be your typical macho man as we would see them. They're more of a representation of rhythm and grace, of a balance, even within that body, between masculine and feminine energies. Remember also that if either of these statues were muscular, muscles imply physical labor. And that's not what these statues are about. These are about transcending the world, not plowing and working through the world. So this beauty isn't about domination, it's about transcendence. Now, I know that a lot of you came here for the finale, and trust me, it is going to be worth it. We are going to take a look at some of the most fantastic male bodies you've ever seen in art history when we look at the Greek and Roman sculptures that are coming up just after this next piece. But I wanted to really quickly jump over to the Americas. The reason is because the British Museum has some of the most incredible objects that you have ever seen from the Americas. One of them is called the Yaxchilan lintel number 24. Can't make anything out of that name if you don't know anything about Mayans, but when you look at it, you better be ready to be blown away, because this is an incredible relief. It's up there in fantasticness, for lack of a better word, with the Assyrian lion hunt. And I picked this one in particular as well because it does have the male form in it. Now, we have to give the Mayans a little bit of a break here. They were a later culture. There was not the same grains. There were not the same domesticable animals in that small strip of Central America that there would have been access to in Asia. It's just different geographic conditions that allowed for certain cultures to kind of be ahead of others. So we never really did reach the level of sculpture in the Americas that we would in contemporary Western culture, but that was because there was that lag due to the geography. And by the time the Spanish came and conquered and colonized, at that point, it was all pretty much wiped out. So we don't know what the apogee of their sculptures would have looked like. But we do have pieces like this. Again, this is the Yaxchilan lintel. It's from a place called Yaxchilan, which is Mayan, and it is in the state of Mexico that's now called Chiapas, but it's here in the British Museum. It's Lord Shield Jaguar II and Lady Cabal Suk, or Shuk, and it's painted limestone relief. It's about the size of a real human torso. It's so big. Before we talk briefly about how the Mayans showed the male body, let's just talk about what's going on here in this lintel. If you haven't guessed it, then you probably are just not familiar with what went on in the Mayan civilization. Why is she kneeling down below him like that? Well, what she's doing is a ritual called bloodletting, and she's pulling a spiked obsidian-studded rope through her tongue because the blood that comes out is part of a ritual ceremony. Now, between you and me, it kind of sucks to have been the wife and have the blood go through your tongue while he stands over you. I don't know enough about this particular Mayan principality to know if he ever did the bloodletting as well. It can't have been a fun experience, but it certainly leaves us with intriguing and fascinating and richly detailed art. Also remember that these would have also been painted, just like the Parthenon in Greece would have been painted different colors. The Mayan stelae and all these kind of reliefs, even the Mayan pyramids, would have all been painted in different colors. I wanted to show this example of indigenous American depiction of the male body because it's quite different. This man, who is also a king, is very stocky. You can see kind of his bare thighs and part of his bare chest. Looks like the arms. That's either tattoo or some sort of covering over the arms, but you can see quite a bit of his body and his build. And you can't help but walk away from it thinking, first of all, it's extremely ornate, including the headdress and all the jewelry, but he is quite stocky. His limbs are dense and he has a broad chest. He also has what looks like kind of that flattened forehead, which they did on purpose, by the way. His pose is stiff and square, and this is done to give his male body the impression of weight and authority. Not motion, not fluidity like we wanted to see the suppleness in the Buddha or the Shiva. This is weight and power. He is standing on top of this ritual. These rituals are important because they are the reason that the earth is going to produce corn and that the rain is going to come. By the way, what he's holding there in his hand is a flaming torch. So again, this king is a ritual performer. He's not an athlete. He's not a warrior. It's important that he carries out these rituals to keep his population going. So it's not as much as it is about protecting from the enemy. They had jaguars, but they did not have lions, and they had conquered a lot of their enemies in the area. So the greatest threat was actually environmental. So these rituals were important. The solidity and the weight and the stability of the head male was the most important thing, not his ability to punch you, his ability to bring the rain and the corn. If you've made it this far, you are absolutely in for a real treat, because I'm going to talk about some of the greatest works in all of Western art history and in the British Museum in a detailed and nuanced way that you've probably never seen before. So get ready to really enjoy this exploration of the male form in art. And what many would argue in sculpture is the height of the expression of the male body in art. We're now going to pivot dramatically backward. Now that we've sampled some other cultures, we're going to go back to the heart of Western civilization. Remember that Western civilization started in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. It also arose nearby in Egypt, both of which had some influence over the next culture, which became dominant in the area and still influences everything today. If you look at the White House and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., Americans in many ways believe ourselves to be the inheritors of ancient Greece. Now let's begin with the section that you've all been waiting for, the apogee, the absolute height of the depiction of the beauty of the male form in Western civilization in classical times. We're going to go to classical Greece, and the first object, the statue that I'm going to show you, is one of the most important statues in the world. People at the British Museum kind of walk past it. They don't even realize that it is one of these important classical works of art because it's in the Enlightenment section of the British Museum, because that's when they acquired it. But it is extremely important, extremely beautiful, and one of the best sculptures you'll ever see. I'm going to tell you more about it. This is Myron's Discobolus. So Myron was the sculptor. It is a Roman copy of a Greek original. And that actually confuses some people and turns them off. Oh, it's just a copy. It's just a copy. No. It is not just a copy. What happened here is that this statue was originally created in bronze by Myron in ancient Greece. Those no longer exist. They have been lost to time. The Romans, who came shortly after the Greeks, still 2,000 years ago, copied the works of the Greeks into marble. And that is how we still have them. So this is an exact copy made by someone in Rome who was also a genius, copying the works of the earlier Greek genius. It's not a copy that was made 10 years ago for the British Museum. It's 2,000 years old. Originally, it would have been created between probably 460 and 450 BC. So that makes it classical Greek. Here at the British Museum, we have one of basically two versions of this Discobolus. The other one is in Rome. So the only two places in the world where you're going to see this authentic statue, the 2,000-year-old Roman copy of the Greek original, is in the British Museum. Nobody understands this. So if you go to the British Museum, you're going to see hundreds of people crowded in front of the Rosetta Stone. You can barely enjoy it. You're going to see a lot of people in the Parthenon area. You're going to see tons of people looking at the mummies. You're going to see almost no one looking at the statue. So go and enjoy it, and let it be a feast for your eyes. Some historical context. Like I said, this was created during the early classical period in Athens. So it's actually before the Parthenon marbles, which we're going to see at the end of the video, which are equally or even more beautiful. It was created after the Persian Wars, during the rise of democracy, rationality, and humanist ideals. This era saw a shift away from the rigid poses of archaic kouroi, which are some of the earlier works of Greek art that actually looked kind of like those early works of Egyptian art that we saw. Remember, we don't see much muscle definition in those. We don't see much of a pose. We kind of see like maybe one foot in front of the other. We're starting to see that in the earlier Greek art. But now we're just seeing this active image. This is an athlete, which is the height of achievement in ancient Greece. And he's caught in the middle of a moment. So we went from the standard of Ur, where we just see these kind of cookie cutter males. We started to see more human features in Egyptian. We started to see muscle in Assyrian. And here we see the perfect male body, down to every sinew of muscle and bone and the features of the hair. And he's in the middle of an action. So we can feel like we're watching something happening. That's a discus that he has, and he's about to throw it. By the way, these discuses were much heavier than the ones that they use now in discus throwing. So it was even a greater achievement. This Discobolus was part of a broader movement to celebrate the human body in motion and in peak condition. What we're seeing here, the way the Greeks would have made this sculpture and the way they would have honored it, is that this is the height of what it means to be human, both physically and morally. When you can achieve this height of athleticism, when you can achieve this height of balance with your body, you are the ideal human being. You are like the Greek gods. So although there is very little hair on this beautiful sculpture of a human being from classical Greek times, there is very intentional hair in two places you've probably noticed. First of all, you have the beautiful curly hair on the head that gives him some character and is really nice to look at from a sculptural artistic standpoint. You also have a little bit of hair there below the waist. You can probably see what I'm talking about. And that was also very intentional because that would signal to the audience that this is an adult. This is someone who has crossed over into adulthood and is in their prime, actually. So this person would have been 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Early 20s was generally seen as peak athletic fitness for a youthful but yet powerful male that would embody all of the great Greek ideals. Here in Myron's Discobolus, the athlete is caught just a split second before he releases the discus. The statue is impressively full of coiled energy, a moment of peak tension, and you can see it in every limb. His body forms a dynamic arc, a tightly wound spiral with his torso twisted, knees bent, arms wide. And yet, despite the implied motion, his face is almost eerily calm. It's almost blank. And this is a reminder of the classical ideal that the Greeks had of inner control, self-discipline, and moderation. The neck is a little bit elongated. The shoulders are pulled back. We're emphasizing openness and symmetry here. The muscles aren't maybe perfectly toned. They're not exaggerated. They don't bulge, but they kind of glide beneath smooth, tight skin. The abdomen is not what we would call ripped. The chest is full and rounded. You can see the pectoral muscles there. The legs and arms are balanced in tension and rhythm. There's no facial strain, no sweat, no messiness. This is idealized male body, God-like calm. The genitals here are small and understated. That's very typical of Greek ideals. What they're trying to do here, whenever you notice a Greek statue as a modern male, you might be looking at it and thinking like, oh, okay, were they maybe a little bit anatomically different 2,000 years ago? Evidence suggests not. What was going on here is that males were portrayed with smaller genitals because in some ways, the Greeks considered the larger genitals to be almost like comic or vulgar or signs of those kind of more base forms of our nature. Now, I don't know how widespread this was amongst the average Greek community, but here we're talking about high art. So in classical Greek high art, you are meant to focus on order, self-control, right? What is one of the hardest things to have self-control over? Well, that's probably why they shrunk it in these statues. So it is a little bit smaller than on what a male would have actually looked like, probably by an inch or a few centimeters, something like that. Now, another thing to notice about the statue in particular, I don't want to get into too much of this kind of detail because it is YouTube, but a man from Europe would normally have body hair. Why is there no body hair in a statue? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, it's very difficult to depict body hair in a statue. Can you imagine? It's much easier just to do it smooth. That is one reason. Second, because the Greek athletes and the Olympians and the people of the time, even up until Roman times, a lot of them did use different methods to get rid of some of their hair, because that was sometimes seen as more orderly, more part of the sophisticated society, and a way to separate themselves from the barbarians or the Germans running around in the woods. There is some body hair. You see it really only in two places. Well, you see hair only in two places. You see it on his head, and then you see it, just a little bit below the waist there. It's so interesting to talk about the male body in art here, because in classical Greek times, it was one of the first times where male nudity here is not erotic and it's not private. It's not just those designs on the vases that we see earlier on. This statue is completely nude, and it is public. It is civic. And it is meant to also have a spiritual value. This nude male was a symbol of virtue and power. Really soak in this image, because it is the basis for so much of our standard of male beauty, and especially its depiction in art. As we zoom down towards the nicely defined legs, we really see the most detailed feet that we've seen anywhere in this video so far. The toes are kind of like curling down a little bit, grabbing the ground that they stand on. It is such a watershed moment in Greek art that we're seeing here that it is really hard to overstate. And I just want everyone watching this video to remember that this statue is 2,000 years old. We are not going to see depictions of this level of detail and beauty in the human body, male or female, again until the Renaissance, until the time of Michelangelo's David. There's a huge gap, but what they achieved here in classical Greek art was nothing less than stunning. We're going to look at one more statue before we go to the Parthenon. Feast your eyes on this next beautiful statue here in the British Museum. We are still in what are called the Enlightenment galleries. You can tell because of the beautiful bookcase behind. But here we are looking at what is called the Rondanini Faun, because it was kept in a Rondanini collection in Rome for a long time before it was here in the British Museum. This is from a later time period. You can see that because it is a Roman copy of Hellenistic Greece. Hellenistic was after classical. So we're talking about maybe 2nd or 1st century BC. The original came from that Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great's empire had shattered, and new kingdoms were starting to emphasize emotion, drama, and individualism in a little bit different of a way than we just saw in that athlete. Remember the Discobolus, the athlete throwing the discus, was a spiritual ideal, the perfect combination of the perfect body and the perfect controlled mind. It's not quite the same here. This beautiful man that we're looking at here is actually a faun in Roman. It would be a faun in the Roman world, and it would be a satyr in Greek. A satyr is kind of a lustful, drunken, woodland god, so they needed to have a lot of fun in their mythology. This was something that would represent the more raucous side of human nature, but the fact that they took the time to spend creating this shows that it's an important part of human expression, that side of our humanity. He rests on one leg, creating kind of a luscious S curve, which is the hallmark of that Hellenistic sculpture, that contrapposto. His head is tilted a little bit. He's probably lost in ecstasy or music. And what he has in his hands there are probably cymbals, because he's probably dancing and making music. There's a playful, almost teasing air. He isn't necessarily performing for others. He's enjoying himself. He's liberating the viewer to enjoy themselves. His body is incredible and incredibly detailed. Lean and lithe, hardly any body fat, definitely some decent muscle on him, long limbs, just a nice narrow trim waist. They really emphasized all the muscles around the abdomen area, not necessarily right around the belly button, but that line that creates almost that U is really, really pronounced. Now, what we are also seeing here when we look at this satyr is that it's not a traditionally masculine pose. So the reason is because we're looking at a faun. We're looking at a satyr that is a representation of kind of fun and abandon and rejection of rigid masculinity, rejection of the rules of society. In classical Greece, order and reason were absolutely paramount. And here we're seeing maybe a little bit of a reaction to that. Maybe this was designed even to titillate the elite who would be looking at this and to remind us not to take life so seriously. Or maybe it was also a commentary on decadence. Was it an appreciation of the aspects of abandon, or was it a critique of it? We don't exactly know. I want to take you all the way around the statue so you can see how great it is. He has really beautiful and detailed feet. Another part of his body that is especially detailed are the knees. The most detailed knees we've seen so far in this video at all in the history of art of the depiction of the male body, especially the left knee as it's bent. You can see every different bone and muscle in the knee. So it is clearly a man in this kind of activity that you are kind of being welcomed to join into. We do see one little piece has fallen off there. That's very common in classical Roman art because appendages were just probably either people were going by and touching it too much, or it's just the fact that it sticks out is more likely to kind of fall off over time. Before we move on from this beautiful statue, and before you move on from it, if you are at the British Museum, I invite you to really stand beneath it. And if you can see this view, if you're standing really below the statue, it is very much an invitation to dance and be free yourself. It does not come across as something stoic, something rigid, something that is shaming you to follow rules. It really invites you to open your arms and play. Now let us move to the most impressive and beautiful part of the British Museum, in my opinion. The most popular thing to see at the British Museum, the Mona Lisa of the British Museum, is really the Rosetta Stone. It's what everyone's going to flock to, but I recommend you only spend a little bit of time looking at that. What you can spend all day in is this beautiful room created for the Parthenon marbles. Since we're studying the male body, we're going to go directly to this beautiful man who is on the east pediment. The east pediment means the eastern side of that triangular portion of the Parthenon. The Acropolis is that sacred hill in classical Athens. The Parthenon is a building, much of which still exists on that sacred hill. These are some of the marbles from the actual Parthenon from ancient Greece. They are here to see in the British Museum, and they are among the most amazing works of art that you will ever see in your life. So the pediment is like that triangle above the entryway. On the east pediment, which is what we're looking at, the scene would have been the birth of Athena. Of course, the city is called Athens because the patron goddess is Athena. Everything in this pediment has to be not only beautiful and wonderfully sculpted, but it has to fit in a triangle. So you can see this man, actually, his head and his knees kind of form a line. It's because he fits into part of that triangle. And what fits into that triangle is absolutely beautiful. What we're looking at here is probably the god of wine, Dionysus, although some people think it might have been Heracles or Theseus. The figure here reclines dramatically on a draped cloth. The drapery of that cloth is astounding, by the way. You could look at that for a few minutes just in and of itself. He's propped up on his left arm. His legs are splayed wide. His torso is upright. His body filling that kind of awkward triangular corner of the pediment with perfect compositional grace, fit in any environment. His reclined posture was not laziness, it's an architectural necessity. The sloping pediment needed a horizontal figure, and the sculptor turned that into an artistic opportunity. The musculature here is stunningly idealized. Broad shoulders taper down to a narrow waist. His abdominals, his pectorals, and quadriceps are sculpted in high relief, giving the illusion of vitality and tension. His body's relaxed but not limp. There's latent power and dignity in the way that he rests. He is mostly nude, but his thin drapery clings to his thighs and glutes. That famous wet drapery effect, which is pioneered here, it actually enhances rather than hides his form, adding almost a sensual touch while still maintaining dignity and that artistic integrity. The nudity here is not aggressive, but it's not heroic either. It's serene, natural, and divinely radiant. His head is intact, which is not that common in these ancient sculptures. It's tilted downward with calm detachment. This is attributed to Phidias, or Phidias's workshop, that great sculptor and architect of classical Greece. The date is probably about 438 to 432 BC. This figure would have once been polychrome, painted in vivid colors, just like those Mayan sculptures and architecture that we talked about. Possibly it would have had bronze accessories, maybe a goblet that he had in his hand, maybe a crown, we don't know. His legs here, interestingly enough, frame the viewer's gaze. We do see some pieces that have obviously fallen off there. It makes his torso the focal point, almost saying, welcome to the party. Relax in this serene moment with me. It kind of teeters on the edge, right on that edge of civilization, orderliness, calmness, and a touch of welcome to this magical, mystical world and the beauty of the human body. This pose is probably a subtle play on visual dominance. One thing that you might want to know about Dionysus, he was also kind of the god of androgyny because, wine opens you up to new possibilities, right? The god of wine. His cult did allow male worshipers to wear women's clothes and kind of abandon normal social roles. So it's very interesting to see here that one of the most beautiful male bodies that we have in existence from classical Greek times is here at the British Museum, and it's of a god that didn't necessarily promote the conforming to standard gender norms. It really isn't a standard, general, heroic, masculine, aggressive gender norm to sit reclining on wet drapery in that open posture like that. So it makes this really visually stunning and artistically interesting. We're going to continue in this beautiful room in the British Museum. This is the room that has the Parthenon marbles. I have actually seen places online, people complaining that this room was too dark or dingy or whatever they've said. I do not know what they are talking about. To me, this is one of the most beautiful rooms I've ever seen in any museum. The natural light comes through, even in London, which isn't necessarily that sunny. It has so much space. You can walk up and down it. The east pediment is on one end, the west pediment is on the other end, and then you get to see all the friezes in between. So now I'm going to talk about the different elements of the Parthenon that are here at the British Museum, and I'm specifically going to focus on the parts of those elements that depict the male body. But first, it's important to know from an art history and architectural standpoint, what are the parts of the Parthenon that are sculpted? Besides, obviously, the statue of Athena, which would have been in the middle, which now I believe is lost to time. What we still have today in the British Museum, you also have some in the Acropolis Museum and some little pieces here and there, maybe in the Louvre. But this is one of my favorite places to see it, here in the British Museum. You have what we already talked about, which are the sculptures from the pediments, those triangles, the east pediment and the west pediment. Then you also have reliefs. The reliefs are either metopes or friezes, and I'll explain the difference. A frieze is just a wraparound relief that tells kind of a story. A metope is similar, but it's divided up between what are called triglyphs. So it's like one scene and then a pause, one scene and then a pause. That's really the only difference. They're basically different forms of reliefs. A relief just means a sculpture that's kind of coming outward from a wall. It's not a standalone sculpture. So the first we're going to look at here is a frieze, and this is part of the North Frieze. It is almost impossible to believe that this frieze was created 2,000-ish years ago. It is so detailed and so beautiful that I could imagine it coming out of Renaissance times. And of course, this is where the Renaissance, the rebirth, got its inspiration from. Let's look at this particular scene because we're talking about the male body. It's just stunning. Hopefully, you might even want to pause on this image. So we see a bunch of different men in this image, and by the way, beautifully sculpted horses What we're seeing here is people as part of a procession. We have kind of one unprepared rider. We have a young kind of a page who is helping another person get the horse ready. And then we have another person, another man with a cape. He's completely naked in front, and then he has a cape on, and he's like looking back a little bit anxiously at the people that are unprepared. But his body and his expression say so much for classical times. Compare this to what we saw from the Assyrian lion hunt. Compare this to what we saw in Egypt. This is an absolute revolution in art. Let's look particularly at the man who is kind of turning around. His movement catches tension across his abs, his flank, and his neck. His body here is robust, emphasizing masculine control over nature and chaos. It really is fascinating. You have to think about, we're preparing for a procession here. We obviously have the clothed man behind and the younger page kind of helping him. But the man in front is fearlessly naked with just his cape that maybe is meant to show that he's flowing in the wind and that there's movement going on. But he is not afraid. He is not ashamed of his body. I really do believe that this is part of the inheritance, and one of the good aspects of the inheritance that we got from ancient Greece is that the human individual and the human body is something that can be celebrated, can be appreciated, and can be enjoyed, and has a beauty all of its own. It is really wonderful to see the beauty of the female body that other artists have done throughout time. But here we are seeing the male counterpart of that. It is a celebration and an opening up to the idea of the male body as an absolutely beautiful thing. To me, the character in this scene is saying, I don't care what you think about me. I am proud, I am strong, and I am beautiful just as I am. It also makes you wonder if there were any subtle messages that the artists were also sending at the time. I believe so. People have always worked within the constraints of their society and have always sent messages that reverberate throughout time to people that thought and felt like them in ways that they could get away with. Next, we're going to look at one of the metopes. It's one of the most beautiful works of art you'll see anywhere in the world. There are several metopes here in this huge section of the British Museum, but this is one of the most striking. Now, last we had seen a frieze, which is that continuous wraparound relief. This is actually a higher relief, which means the sculptures are coming even further out from the wall in these metopes, and they're meant to be tiny little mini stories with little pauses in between them. What we're seeing here in this stunning and beautiful metope from, again, around 2,000 years ago is a fight between Centaurs and Lapiths. The Centaur is on the left. That's the person that is not fully human, obviously, part horse, part human, and the Lapith is on the right. This would have been a common story for people in classical Greece. And basically the story is that the Lapiths had a gathering and they were gracious enough to invite the more wild centaurs who lived in the area to their party. But the centaurs, being wild and disorderly and kind of more animalistic, obviously, started to do things to the women, the Lapith women, that the Lapiths did not want. They were, quote unquote, abducting the women in the middle of the party. And you know what that means in classical times, right? So then this battle ensues between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. And this is just a really common theme, but what it allowed artists to do when telling this story was to show their mastery of the human body, especially the male body. I mean, if you zoom in for just a second, we're going to get into more detail about these bodies, but the first thing that stands out to me right away, look at the veins in the forearm of that centaur. But what it allowed artists to do was not only to show details of human body, a little bit of animal, to show expressions in faces because they're fighting, but it allowed them to play with this kind of dance between chaos and order, which is a constant theme in classical art and in world history. It's the reason we build civilizations and have kings, because we want to defeat chaos and order. And it also represents a battle going on within each and every man. These higher ideals of harmony and balance and planning for the future, and those robust animalistic desires to live for and in the moment. So here we have this muscular centaur. He's nude and aggressive and animalistic. He rears up and he wraps he grabs this guy by the neck, this Lapith by the neck in a chokehold. The Lapith is also nude, I guess. Who wouldn't be at a party just sitting around naked, right? He's caught off guard. His body is kind of, twisting in pain. He's trying to get that final punch connecting right there with the centaur's head. And the legs are intertwined, which is really, really interesting. First of all, it allows us to do something really fun artistically, lock a horse's leg with a human's leg. I mean, how fun is that from a visual standpoint? It also might have some subtext there. Remember, we talked about there's a lot of times subtext in art and different people's exploring different expressions of life and maybe even of sexuality through ways of giving subtle hints in art. Was a little bit of that going on there? We don't know. Kind of looks like it to me. But these legs being intertwined show a physical closeness that it creates a moment that is at the same time, this is what's most interesting, at the same time the moment is violent and intimate. So what we're doing here is actually a genius moment in art. It is a genius depiction of male bodies and, well, one body that's part male, part horse, but it is also a genius depiction of duality, violence and intimacy. Kind of like lust and anger and order and chaos, all happening in the same moment in just this one beautiful metope. Let's finish today with a striking piece of marble, a beautiful sculpture from the West Pediment on the other end of this beautiful hall in the British Museum. Here we see this extravagantly beautiful man lying in his drapery. This is believed to be the river god, Ilissus. Now remember, this is part of that pediment, part of the triangle, so it has to fit in that sloping up. Something that's really significant about this piece before we start talking about what a great example it is of the male body in art is that we have to remember that this was carved from a single stone, a single piece of marble. So just imagine that marble melting away under the hands of Phidias or someone in Phidias's workshop to reveal this beauty right here. So this is the figure of this reclining naked man or god. They were almost the same in terms of their physical form in a lot of classical Greece. Take a look at that piece of drapery. It's kind of falling off of his left arm there. It's almost as if he's turning. So remember, we saw the beginnings of action and motion in that Discobolus. We're seeing some motion here too. Long gone are the stiff days of ancient Mesopotamia and Ur or even Egypt. We're seeing a body where the muscles are acting. They're active and they're turning. It's really something beautiful to behold and set the standard, again, for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. If you're wondering what's going on this West Pediment versus the East Pediment, remember that the East Pediment was the birth of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. This West Pediment, in which this river god lounges and reclines, is actually something to do with Athena. What you would see if you saw the full West Pediment, which you can actually go see in Nashville in the United States, interestingly enough, because they've recreated their life-size, without the missing heads. But if you were to see the full West Pediment, you would see a contest between Athena and Poseidon to be the patron saint of Athens. So that's the backdrop for all the different characters that would have been in this triangular slope where we see this beautiful river god. An incredible thing that you get to do and you get to see that you wouldn't have been able to see on the actual Parthenon back in the times of classical Greece. You can actually walk around this entire West Pediment, you can do the same on the East Pediment, and you can see the backsides of these sculptures. The backside of this man is incredible. It has just as much detail as the front. His body, his proportion, his movement. You can see the muscles in his back. You can see the gluteus muscle. This would have never been seen in its original form. So the fact that the artist took this much time to work on this beautiful piece showed that there was almost a divine relationship between the artist and the creation here. The musculature here is a perfect representation of classical Greece. It is athletic, controlled, refined, but it is not exaggerated. It is not grotesque. It does not look like somebody who spends 4 hours a day in a gym. It almost looks natural. Of course, we know that for most people, this would not be the natural body form, but that's what's going on here with this classical Greek depiction of the male body. The musculature is taut but elegant. Long limbs, lean torso, slight twist at the hips. It just feels alive and responsive. It's almost, when you go up to the statue, it's almost like he's climbing out of the water to greet you. That drapery that clings to that shoulder it just looks like wet fabric, and it's an effect that is done so masterfully that the marble actually looks soft and translucent. And although this guy doesn't have a head, that fell off a long time ago, even before the 1600s when someone sketched it, it is intact in another area that you see there. It looks like that didn't fall off, and that is pretty masterfully done, actually. We are still seeing the same conventions that we saw earlier. It is probably a little bit smaller than an anatomical human is or would have been. And remember, because the Greeks saw order and self-control as the most important thing, they felt that it was almost a little bit grotesque, or at least very mundane, if you were walking around kind of what we would say as a big guy. Aristotle, the famous philosopher and scientist, even suggested in his Problemata that such men that were not as refined as this, that would have, bigger men, if you know what I mean, were actually less fertile and less vigorous. It's kind of the opposite of what we probably think of now and what we came to think later, but that's what the Greeks thought. They thought you had to kind of shrink it up a little bit in order to be refined and divine. Now, that would change in Roman culture. They had a little bit more going on with the god Priapus, and it was not as much of a taboo to show either a natural size or a larger size. But here in Greek classical times, it has to be tidy. All of the conventions that I've talked about when I look at this depiction of the male body in classical Greek art here with this river god, the same thing with Dionysus that we talked about earlier, the same thing with the Discobolus, all of these different conventions, whether there is or where there is body hair, whether we're talking about size, whether we're talking about musculature, how men are perceived, all of these conventions stayed with us for a very, very long time. Now, it is incredibly beautiful to look at this statue. From an artistic standpoint, no matter what gender you are, you cannot walk away without thinking that this is a beautiful work of art. And these are beautiful male bodies. But I just want to put out a little bit of criticism that has started to happen in about the 19th century and into modern art onwards, is that they believed that the male body was beautiful in many different forms, whereas this classical Greek ideal kind of says you got to look like this. And I think that's an important conversation to have. I think it is absolutely beautiful, this type of body, and it's a beautiful work of art, and it's wonderful to look at. But I also think that there are diverse forms of the male body and the female body that are equally beautiful and equally interesting, whether it's slim or whether it's even a little bit more muscular or whatever. You're not going to see this in art. You're not going to see this until after the Renaissance, when people like Michelangelo kind of mimic or are inspired by classical Greece, and that's going to continue for hundreds and hundreds of years until the 1800s, when we get into realism and when we get into reinterpreting art in a modern way and kind of questioning, why were we so obsessed with a male body looking like this? Some would argue that there is some damage done by this obsession with classical Greek ideals, and that it's kind of locked us into this one size fits all, everybody should reach this ideal, which obviously not everyone can, because everyone has different body types and different lifestyles and different environments. So I think there is some validity to that criticism. The fact that Greeks did almost all their male bodies like this kind of made it seem like that was the only way to be beautiful, and it's simply not. But having said that and having put that criticism out there, it is a wonderful time to come and enjoy the sheer beauty of what these classical Greeks created when they were looking at and replicating the male form. It's also wonderful to get into the mythology. It's wonderful to see how marble could be sculpted that way. And it's just a fantastic museum. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey with me through one of the greatest museums in the world. In just the space of this museum, now it's large as far as museums go, but it is nowhere near as large as the territory and the thousands of years that we crossed in today's journey. And that is the great thing about great museums, and really all museums. You can travel to a different place in time. We've gone thousands of years and spanned continents. We've seen how the male body has been shaped by culture and shaped culture in religion, in power, and myth. We started in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, where the male body was this rigid vessel for authority, kind of frozen in timelessness. Then we saw in Assyria, it was a tool for warfare. It came alive with musculature, active, commanding, vibrant. We went all the way to India. In just this British museum, we went all the way to India. The body transformed into the spiritual ideal that was above the duality of gender, radiating this divine presence. We got a glimpse into Mayan art where we saw it became ritualistic and heavy, embedded with blood and meaning. And finally, we relaxed along the river with this river god on top of the Acropolis in ancient Greece at the Parthenon, here in the British Museum, with the Greek sculpture, where something shifted that would last and resonate forever. The male body became not just an image of strength or status, but an expression of aesthetic beauty, pleasure, humanity, the importance of humans and their role in the world as individuals, and an inner ideal. If you enjoyed this exploration of the male body here at the British Museum, take a look at some of my other videos where I do the same thing. I have another one called Men in Art at the Metropolitan Museum, where I take a look at some gorgeous paintings and see how men were depicted differently and how their bodies reflected different psychological ideas that were going on in the minds of the artist. It's very fascinating. If you want more general museum videos, this is also the place for you, because I've done the top 10 works in the Met, in MoMA in New York City. I've done the top 10 in the Kunsthistorisch in Vienna, which is a fantastic museum. And I've also done the top 10 in the National Gallery, and so much more to come if you stick around on this channel. I'm going to try to do both of these things, these kind of niche and interesting videos and a little bit more general ones. But even the general ones get really rich and really deep into the beauty behind these works of art. I want to inspire you to engage and even meditate on these works of art, because we're so distracted and we're so isolated with our constant dopamine going on our phones. To go to a museum, or even to watch a video and pause it and look at one of these works of art for a minute, maybe two, some people do it for hours, creates an experience that may be lost to the modern era. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. I'd love to hear from you in the comment section, where you are free to tell me what you liked, and you're also free to tell me any criticisms that you may have. This is not a channel where I just want to give my opinion and be right. It's very important for me to be accurate. If I get facts wrong, the great thing about YouTube is that you can tell me that, and I can get better in the next video, and we can have a little bit of a dialogue there in the comment section. So I would love to hear from you, no matter what you thought. It's great hearing your words of encouragement. I definitely appreciate it. This is not an AI channel. This is created by a human being who loves museums and who loves art. Thank you for coming with me.